I don't need any help.
You do. Not the man I knew 10 years ago.
It's not the years, honey. It's the mileage.
Oh, greetings, Bucketheads. Mavar Tigar. Welcome to another special bonus episode of Mando Vision. Nargai Tom, and thank you so much for checking out our small independent Star Wars podcast, which is currently spending a lot of time talking about Indiana Jones. That's just how it goes right now. Sorry, folks. The best way to reach out to us is on social media at Mando_Vision on Twitter and Instagram. You can email the show, mandovisiontom@gmail.com. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow, and share the show with all the Mandalorians in your covert. Well, as I said, we're back for another non-Star Wars-based episode of the show. And again, it wasn't necessarily the plan. But I made it to the theaters. I saw Indiana Jones and Dial of Destiny. And since we've spent the last 2 weeks talking about two of my favorite Indiana Jones films, it seemed only fitting to talk about this film now that it's out, now that it's in theaters. And judging by the box office numbers that have been coming in today, on Monday as I record this, I am one of the few people who've seen it. So, though, again, a lot on my social media, which is dominated by a lot of Star Wars fans and Star Wars fan sites and other podcasts and YouTubers and things like that, apparently we all saw Indiana Jones. The rest of the world, however, has not. So I want to believe that the people of this good audience, people of Buckethead Nation, did go check out the new Indiana Jones movie. So we're going to have a conversation, but I am going to try and keep it relatively spoiler-free, because if you haven't seen it yet, I want you to go check it out and be along for the ride and not have to know necessarily all the story beats that are coming up in due course as you watch the film. But as you know, sometimes that is a slippery slope when you try to stay spoiler-free. Sometimes you can say something that is completely innocent, but that you, the audience member, didn't want to know going in. And so I will strongly encourage anyone who hasn't seen the movie, who has plans to see the film, to listen to this podcast after. If you want to go in clean, if you've been avoiding stuff on the internet, if you've been avoiding trailers and reviews and all those things, just stick this in your feed, download it, because I appreciate the support, and then listen to it after you've had a chance to see the film. I had hoped to have a guest on this episode as we talk about the film, because I really would like to bounce some things off of other people as I discuss this film, because I saw it on Saturday, and I basically spent the rest of the weekend thinking about the movie and how certain elements of it made me feel. And there are things in it that I'm very pro. There are things in it that I'm kind of against, and again, we'll talk about that. If I get a chance down the road to sit down with one of our podcast friends to do an episode and kind of really dig deep on Dial of Destiny, that would be fun. But we'll save that for later. So I'm going to try and just kind of give you my feelings without really pulling apart the movie too much, because you can. I mean, it's a movie with threads that if you yank on them, the sweater will become undone, and that's just how it is with some movies. I will say, before we dive too deep into and specifically on Dial of Destiny, is that watching this movie, really inspired me to go back and rewatch Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, a film that I also have a lot of mixed feelings on. The easiest answer I've given over the years is like, well, it's my fourth favorite Indiana Jones film, and I say that in a kind of like a positive way because it's still an Indiana Jones movie. I'm still having a good time with it. It's just not as good as the original three. And Dial of Destiny, I'll say it right up front. I think it is better than Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, but not by much. It's very close. There's like I said, I went back rewatched Crystal Skull this weekend, and there are a lot of things that I sort of missed seeing in Dial of Destiny, and we'll talk about that more when we get to the other side of the little bump. All right, so save yourselves for that. But we'll be talking about Crystal Skull quite a bit too, because I think these movies have a lot more in common than maybe people wanted to believe when they set out to make this movie, and I'll try my best to talk about that again in as non-spoilery as a way as I can. But if you want to go into Dial of Destiny clean, not knowing anything, by all means, pause this podcast, make sure you downloaded it, and then come back after you've seen the flick and see if you think I'm crazy or not, all right? So let's talk about the specifics of the film. This is for Indiana Jones and Dial of Destiny, released this past week, June 30th, 2023. It's directed by James Mangold, written by James Mangold and Jez Butterworth, John Henry Butterworth. David Koepp gets a he did like the initial screenplay back when Steven Spielberg was involved, so I guess he's getting a written by credit still, which is interesting because I don't think he had much to do with this current draft. But David Koepp also, by and large, did a big chunk of the writing on Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. So, depending on your feelings for that film, you may think that's a good thing that he's not so much in this one. Our primary cast is, of course, Harrison Ford as Indiana Jones one more time. Phoebe Waller-Bridge is Helena. Antonio Banderas shows up in this movie. I'm going to skip a couple people because I don't want you to know if they're in the movie or not. John Rhys Davies, we've seen in the trailers. Thomas Kreitzman. Poor Thomas Kreitzman. Will this man ever get to play somebody who's not a Nazi? I don't know. Toby Jones is in this. One of my favorite actors, one of my favorite villains, honestly, is Mads Mikkelsen, and I'm so glad he's in an Indiana Jones movie teaming up with Harrison Ford. That makes me very, very happy. And Boyd Holbrook. And we will talk about Boyd Holbrook. Don't even think we won't, okay? So those are our primary players for the film. John Williams, of course, returns to do the score on this one because he has to. I think he is obligated by God himself to always score an Indiana Jones movie. And, important to note, we'll get into this on the other side too. But, yeah, directed by James Mangold. We are not directed by Steven Spielberg in this movie. And, again, you can make an argument that that's good. You can make an argument that that's bad. And again, we'll probably mention that a little bit. But let's go ahead, get into the conversation. You know what time it is. Strap on your buckets. Strap on your fedoras. Let's go.
I miss the desert. I miss the sea. And I miss waking up every morning, wondering what wonderful adventure the new day will bring to us.
Those days have come and gone.
Perhaps not.
All right, so let's just get to it. Let's just put it right out there on Front Street right now. I like Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. I think it is a perfectly fun, enjoyable movie. One last romp with our favorite archaeologist / adventurer, Indiana Jones himself. Harrison Ford puts in a very nice performance here for his final go-around. You can tell it's a character that he is very attached to, that he's very fond of, as he brings it, just like he always does. And again, there's a lot in this movie to really, really enjoy. There's a lot of fun. There's highs and lows, just like with Crystal Skull, in my opinion. But I think for the most part, people will like this flick more than Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Specifically, if you were not a fan of anything in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, I think this will be a nice kind of writing of the franchise, right? For at least in your opinion, right? I think you'll get a lot out of it. Again, it's fun. The characters are good. They're enjoyable. It's a really strong cast. But it does. It's not without things that you can, threads that you can start pulling on, and the whole thing kind of falls apart like a weak tapestry. And again, without getting too spoilery, it really depends on your mileage, right? Like how much, as an audience member, are you willing to look past these things in order to enjoy yourself on what is more than likely Harrison Ford's last adventure as Indiana Jones. And I think if you can put up with a few things, I think you're going to have a perfectly lovely time at the theater, if you go see it in the theaters. And I think you should. I do. I do think this is a movie worth checking out on the big screen. I have seen 3 of the 5 indies in theaters. They're always worth checking out on the big screen. James Mangold does a fine job directing, though I do think I missed some of the little touches that Steven Spielberg brought to the previous films. There was not as much of that sort of indie wry humor, situational kind of humor that pops up on his adventures. There wasn't much of that in this. That's not really Mangold's thing, and maybe that was a conscious decision to like not try and riff heavily on what Spielberg's done in the past. I couldn't say for sure. I mean, again, Mangold is a very capable director. He's done some fine films, and he brings his style, his flair to it. So, in one sense, it does certain shots seem modeled after maybe what Spielberg would have done, but otherwise, action-wise, I think it's very very Mangold-esque, and that's a service to him. One of the things what we're going to do a lot is there's going to be a lot of me comparing this to Crystal Skull, because I do think there has to be sort of like a line of delineation between the first 3 films, the 80s Indiana Jones movies versus the 2000s Indiana Jones movies, because a lot's changed, right? Like we had to move our timeline forward in Crystal Skull. We fought Soviets. We were in the 50s. We were in the dawn of the nuclear age, and one of the things I think you could rightly criticized Crystal Skull for was, yes, we moved the timeline forward. We changed our enemies. We changed the global politics. The Red Scare was in full effect. Everyone was looking for communists everywhere, and it sort of affected our world in which Indiana Jones inhabits. But Indiana Jones himself wasn't too altered. There were moments where you could see Indy becoming more like his father. Seeing, certain looks, saying this is intolerable, things like that, that are callbacks to Last Crusade as Indy's sort of aging into the man that his father was at a certain point. And that's neat. That's interesting. And I think one of those things where Crystal Skull sort of trips up on itself is that, its early mission statement is that Indy's losing things, right? Like he's reached the age now in life where life is taking more than it's giving to him, right? It's like we talk in the beginning of that film about the loss of Henry Jones Sr., of Marcus Brody. And then by the end of that picture, Indy's gained, right? He's gained a son. He's gained a wife in Marion. And so life gives back to Indy at a certain point in that picture. And it's sort of a muddled journey to get to there. But what we don't really address is sort of the aging of Indiana Jones, other than quips from Mutt during that film. Do we really see Indiana Jones aging out of being able to do the things that he can do? It's still very Indiana Jones in that regards. And I think if you're along for that ride, then cool. That's a good time. What this film attempts to do is it sort of goes and treads a lot of similar ground, because it's about loss, and how loss this time around has severely affected Indiana Jones. And this is a very different Indiana Jones than what we've seen before. Again, he has a trauma now, and that is going to rub some people in the audience the wrong way. That's just going to be how it is. Like some people like their Indiana Jones the way they like their Indiana Jones. But Indiana Jones has always been a very human, very vulnerable character. But this time we're giving him some emotional baggage that he hasn't had in the past. And like I said, I think that will rub some people, one person specifically in this audience, the wrong way. and maybe some other people out there in the world as well. But Indiana Jones now has some emotional baggage to deal with. The way that baggage gets unpacked in this film, I think, is unfortunate. It's not my favorite method of storytelling. It's done in like sort of like a weird random exposition dump, and I didn't care for it. And I wish they had done that better. And that's sort of what you're going to get a lot from me out of in my Dial of Destiny reaction is the things that I had problems with weren't necessarily things that were I felt were inherently wrong with the film, with the picture itself. It's just something that I wish was executed differently. I think it would have been just as effective, or perhaps even more effective, if they had kind of to use a Hollywood parlance to show and not tell. And there's a lot of telling in this movie, which is sort of unfortunate. But again, it's highs and lows. And again, I think this movie has more in common with Crystal Skull than it intended to, because we are sort of telling the story of loss, and the story of like remembering what you already have. This is also a story about Indiana Jones because of his loss. He's now sort of living in the past, right? Not necessarily his past, but like history. He's always been sort of like the history guy, right? And he's not moving forward. The world around him continues to move forward, and Indiana Jones himself is sort of stuck in place because of his losses and his traumas. What the movie attempts to do is get Indiana Jones right in the head so that by the end of the picture he is able to move forward. How they get him to that point, again, I wish was executed a little bit differently. It works. Everything ultimately works that they do. I just wish it had been done a little differently. I wish it had been executed a little differently. And and like I said, there's more in common. This movie has more in common with Crystal Skull than I think it wants to admit. We'll just talk about one particular aspect of the film, so I can compare it to Crystal Skull. Is at one point in this film, Indiana Jones is in a situation where he's got to leave the country. He's got to go. It's a completely unnecessary plot point, in my opinion. I thought it was the scene that led up to it, the action that took place that put Indiana Jones in this position where he feels he has to leave America, is probably one of the more gratuitous acts of violence I've ever seen in an Indiana Jones movie. And I suspect it only existed, A, to reinforce that the bad guys are really bad, and B, that we needed to push Indiana Jones out of his comfort zone that he's kind of lived in these last few years of his life. But if you go back to Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, like I just did last night, the Red Scare is in effect. And the CIA thinks that thinks that Indiana Jones is a communist. So he's going to leave his university. He's being under suspicion, right? He's being put on leave by his university. So he's going to leave America. He's going to go to the University of Leipzig. He says this in the movie. He's Leipzig, of all places. He's going back to Germany. There's something kind of funny about that when you really kind of pull the layers apart on that statement. But again, like this is sort of what these movies do, right? Like there's sort of like this weird parallel between Crystal Skull and this flick. And I don't even think the people who made this movie were even aware of it. I really don't. But watching Crystal Skull last night sort of reminded me, it's like, oh yeah, Indy was trying to leave the country before this all started. And the only reason why he doesn't end up in Germany is because that's when Mutt steps up with the letters from Oxley and sends them off on the adventure in South America. That sort of parlays everything around. This time around, like the incident in question does get Indy out of the country, but it puts him back on the trail of his goddaughter, who has stolen an artifact that Indy had kept hidden from her father for many, many years. The Dial of Destiny, spoiler alert, also known as the Antikythera in the film. So there's a lot to compare with Crystal Skull, and I want to keep that in mind for everybody. I do want to go back because I think everyone's heard about it. We saw it in the trailers. It merits mentioning in a somewhat involved conversation. The opening sequence, like the prequel of the film, the sort of prologue to the story, right? Of the de-aged Harrison Ford, the de-aged Indiana Jones, back in the end stages of World War II, back in Germany. They're at a castle. They end up on a German loot train, full of artifacts, and a lot of them are fake, a lot of them are real. It's this whole thing. It's all very, very interesting stuff. I like the sequence quite a bit. I think the de-aging, by and large, looks very, very good. I think they did a nice job with the effects on that. You'll notice that the train sequence in particular is at night, which means that they're trying to cover up some CG, so it's not as obvious that it's CG. But by and large, I think it works out pretty well. The only thing that's sort of jarring is that when Indy's talking, you know that it's old man Indiana Jones talking. Like there's a difference in Harrison Ford's voice timbre from his age now versus 30, 40 years ago when he was making Raiders and Temple and even Last Crusade. So it's sort of I'll just use the word jarring again to describe the Harrison Ford's old man voice in his young man, quote unquote young man face. So, but by and large, it works. One of the elements I wanted to talk about too is like, they're not even, Indy and his friend Basil aren't even looking for the Dial of Destiny at this point, aka the Antikythera. It's something that Basil's interested in. He sort of has like this. It's sort of like his pet hobby, the Antikythera. But they're not there for that. They're there to track down the Lance of Longinus. The Lance of Longinus is another a religious artifact from Christianity. We talked about that, like the Ark of the Covenant, the Holy Grail. Indiana Jones has a lot of experience with Christian artifacts, right? Like you can make a movie. You can be of the opinion that his best movies are the ones that deal with Christian artifacts, right? Well, the Lance of Longinus is also interesting because if you're an old head like me, you may remember that back in the 90s, Dark Horse, along with having the license for Star Wars, also had the license for making Indiana Jones comics. And they made an Indiana Jones and the Spear of Destiny comic book, which is another name for the Lance of Longinus. So I thought that was very, very interesting that we sort of end up on this adventure. And I'm like, wait, I've seen this adventure before, but it was very, very different because in the comic book, it was another adventure with Indy's dad. So it was Henry Jones Jr. and Sr. teaming up again for another Christian artifact, much like they did in Holy Grail. So I may have to track down those comics and reread those because it has been, when were the 90s? Well, the 90s were a long time ago, friends. So I do not remember most of it. But I was like, that sort of tickled me a little bit to see that we opened the movie on an artifact that technically has an adventure that is, in theory was supposed to be canon, but maybe it's no longer canon after the Disney acquisition. But regardless, they threw it all out the window anyways, and we end up on this quest for the Lance of Longinus, which I thought was very, very interesting. I thought it was very, very fun, even though we all knew that ultimately we get persuaded to follow the Dial of Destiny. How much do I want to talk about everything else? Again, I want to try to keep this thing spoiler free. The prologue's great. I mean, we sort of set everything up in place. Indy's first interaction with the Dial, his first interaction with Voller, the scientist, played by Mads Mikkelsen, who will be the protagonist, in 1969 when we get to our current timeline, our current time period that we're set in. I guess I'll just kind of talk about in broad strokes of the characters, right? So I like Mads as a villain. Mads is always a great villain. He's always an interesting villain. He's not so much in this for like the supernatural, for the he's a math guy, right? He's a science guy, and he believes that these artifacts are just complicated algorithms and arithmetic, right? To make things work. I don't want to say necessarily. I'm sure most people know what the Dial is and has been rumored to be. But if you haven't seen the flick yet and you're still listening to this podcast, I'm not going to go into any specific great detail right now. But it is interesting that for this supernatural artifact to work, it's based on sort of like a pseudoscience, right? Like mathematicians. And that's what I'm going to say about that. I'm going to stop there. Mads is an interesting villain. He's not fully developed, not fully well-rounded, but it's Mads Mikkelsen, and he plays it well, and he owns it. And I enjoy seeing him on screen. I wish they had done more with him. I also wish they had done more with his henchman characters, one of whom is played by Boyd Holbrook, an actor of some renown who's been in many, many things, and could be argued as a pretty big star in his own right. I don't know why he's in this movie. I have zero idea what was going on with his character. I mean, you sort of inferred a lot based off of random things they said and did, but I still have no idea why Boyd Holbrook is in this picture. The only thing I can think of is that there's an entire storyline around that character that was completely cut from the film. And speaking of that, this movie's really long. It's a really long movie. I used to wish movies were longer back in the day. And I've always enjoyed those movies that like make you feel like you want more, right? Nowadays, we've gotten to the point where I'm just like, are we sure we needed more? Did we really need that much more? And I think you'll get the sense of that in this movie, as some of like the chase scenes are sort of prolonged and extended. I think you'll sort of see where I'm coming from. And again, that makes me wonder. It's like, I bet that character, was it Kluber? Something like that, is the character played by Boyd Holbrook. And again, I'm sure there's a whole storyline around this character that probably is the reason why Boyd Holbrook said he'd be in this movie. That's completely cut out because this movie is really, really long. And if they had kept everything in it, it probably would have been a 3-hour cut, which I couldn't imagine this movie being 3 hours. My God. Again, not that it's bad, but, movies have to be shaped and developed. And this movie's already a little bit like pulling taffy. It's a little long in the tooth. There's ebbs and flows to it. The pacing's a little all over the place. And again, some of its themes are sort of all over the place too. Let's talk about Helena. Played by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, who I am a big fan of. I enjoy her work. I enjoy her writing. I enjoy sort of her comedic stylings, if you will. I think she's a wonderful addition to the movie. What I sort of have an issue with is she's sometimes difficult to like. Her relationship with Indy is tenuous at best. And by the third act, apparently they're all good. And I don't really know how and why and when that all happened. Again, maybe there's some development things that got cut out. But we go from them sort of being adversarial to being sacrificing for each other, and I don't quite know when we make that jump. Perhaps on a rewatch I'll pick up something that I missed before, but it does seem to happen fairly quickly in the movie, and that sort of bums me out. But by and large, the character ends up where we need them to end up, and I guess that's sort of another knock on the picture. Everyone gets where we need them to go. I don't always like the way they get there, but they get there. And I guess that kind of works for what we needed it to work for. I want to make another comparison to Crystal Skull here because, again, a lot of my concerns, a lot of my challenges with Crystal Skull came at the end of the second act and into the third act. Well, that's where a lot of my concerns are in this movie as well. And depending on your mileage for Crystal Skull, you may bump into the same problems in this movie. And you're either going to go all in or all out based on the third act of this film. I can't say, I'm trying to avoid saying what exactly that all entails. I mean, maybe you've already listened to 3 spoiler-filled podcasts and you know already. But something happens. The Dial of Destiny does its thing, and something happens. And Indy's presented with a choice. And the resolution to that choice is interesting. I really want to pull apart that section with somebody on in a conversation sometime soon. But I don't. Again, I sort of don't like the way that shakes out. There's parts of it that I just really. Again, I don't like that we have to sort of lead Indy by the nose to get to the point where he has to understand that he has to exist in his place and time and move forward with things and not become a relic of history. That's sort of what this movie's trying to tell us, or trying to tell Indiana Jones, is to stop living in the past and live in the now. And spoilers, I guess. I guess that's the biggest spoiler, is that the movie's a lot about Harrison Ford, or about Indiana Jones learning to live in the now and stop burying his head in the books and living in the past. And sometimes literally. And, I don't know. it's hard to give these like a spoiler-free review without talking about some of the things. But by and large, there are a lot of fun sequences. I enjoyed the tuk-tuk chase. I enjoyed the underwater sequence. Right, we haven't seen that before in an Indiana Jones picture. I enjoyed the character that Antonio Banderas plays. I enjoyed getting to see Sala again. I enjoyed the backstory of Sala, that Indiana Jones brings Sala over to America after all the help he gave him, and and he helps his family out escaping bad things in the aftermath of World War II. There's a lot of stuff in the movie that I really, really like. One of the other elements too, again, you sort of, it requires you to have a good knowledge of the previous films, but seeing Indiana Jones as a professor again, and seeing, look back to Raiders and the way his classrooms were packed and the students were attentive and the female students were in love with the professor, and then see him as the professor in this film and see how far it's all gone. It's a sparsely attended class. No one's paying attention. And the women could care less about him up there. It's sort of this interesting progression for him as a teacher, right? It's interesting in that regard. There's a lot of little things in there that I really do enjoy. There is the element with Voller in the modern era is dubious at best. They're playing him as sort of like a Werner von Braun character, a Nazi scientist who was granted asylum so that he could help the space program. That's sort of who Voller is in this, though he's going by the name Schmidt at certain points of this, which only made me think of the Red Skull. So I couldn't help that. That was just the Marvel maniac in my brain. He sort of cuts his deal with the government, like he's going to give them all this like space rocket technology to get people to the moon, which is that the primary setting that we've seen in the trailers. Indy on the horse with the ticker tape parade. They're celebrating Moon Day. The astronauts are back from the moon, and there's the parade going on to celebrate them. Well, Voller in this film is like the scientist whose rocket technology put them on the moon in the first place. So Voller sort of cut a deal with the government that, like, I'll get you on the moon, but you got to help me get the other components of the Antikythera, aka the Dial of Destiny. And then once the government gets what they want, they're sort of willing to cut Voller loose. But Voller, I guess behind the scenes, because we don't see any of this stuff, but apparently he has a bunch of very loyal henchmen who he has persuaded that being a Nazi was super cool and good, which I suppose is supposed to be a commentary on the current state of Nazism in America, which is, again, one of those things that is shockingly still relevant and shockingly on the rise. So it seems like they're commenting on that. And it's sort of, I guess, a reminder that people are attracted to those with power, I guess. Again, there's sort of like this. There's a couple of weird ideas that aren't really fleshed out. One of them is this idea that Voller just sort of has like these young Nazi protege people in his employ. And it's never really fleshed out. I'd love to know more about it. Love to know more about what he told these people to kind of get them on board with Nazism. But again, it's more known now in the history books. But like Nazism never went away, especially in the States. It's only kind of just become more subversive, but it's grown as it's become more subversive at the same time. So I suppose they're commenting on that in a sort of like, hey, look, this is over here too. They don't really go into any depth with it. It's a very shallow notion. And again, like I said, there may have been an entire plot line about that is sort of glossed over or just completely left on the cutting room floor. And I'm very, very curious about it. But what else can I say about the film? Again, like I said, so much of it, like Crystal Skull, hinges on the third act. And if you're in, you're in. And if you're out, you're out. I hope that you're in. I do. I think the picture has a lot of, like I said, it has some good moments, some good pieces. I wish they would have had a little bit more pizzazz in the narrative. I wish there was a bit more showing and not telling. A lot of things we learn are in random bits of exposition. Again, I wish the development, the relationship between Helena and Indy had sort of developed more organically than it did. But there's a lot in the picture that I really did enjoy, and I am looking forward to seeing it again on another viewing, whether that's in theaters or not, or when it comes out on home release or Disney Plus or whatever. I'm not quite sure just yet. July has a couple different movies coming out this month that I'm fairly interested in checking out, so we'll have to see how that plays out. But I think for Indy's final ride, this is a pretty darn good time. And it just depends on. We played the line at the opening of the podcast. It's not the years, honey. It's the mileage. Well, what's your mileage for Indiana Jones and your suspension of disbelief, right? Audiences seem to have turned very against. Back in Crystal Skull, audiences had turned against like the sci-fi elements that were brought into that movie, despite the fact that they had no problem with people getting their faces melted off by dark angels living in a box. So I don't know. When do people turn on a dime like that? I can't quite remember. But yeah. So again, your enjoyment of the movie will hinge on that third act, and if you're in or out. If you're in, I think you're in. But again, even then, I was in. But it still sort of wraps up in a way that I was like, huh. We sort of had to lead Indy by the nose for that one. But I guess we get him where we need to get him to. And I know I'm being obtuse. I know I'm being vague. I suspect it'll be a very spoiler-filled podcast about this movie down the road. But I'm just waiting to have a conversation with somebody about it, as opposed to me just spouting off about it nonstop for an hour. So, that being said, I do like the way the film ends. I have a million questions, though, because, again, the Helena character is sort of a shady character. And then at some point, it seems that she becomes more like Indy, more noble and making like the hero play, right? But when does that exactly occur? I'm not entirely certain. There's a child sidekick character, Teddy, who actually I thought was pretty good. Though, again, this movie, I guess I don't even know if I said it before. A lot of the movie's third act is telegraphed earlier in the film, and if you're paying attention, if you've seen enough movies, you're gonna be like, oh, well, that's gonna come into play later. Oh, well, that's gonna come into play later, and yeah, they do. They definitely do. They telegraph a lot of things, and that's sort of, again, what's your mileage with that? Is that to the film's benefit or detriment? That's for you to decide. So, yeah, check it out. Check it out. It wraps up nicely. I think it's a good send-off for Indy. I think it's a good send-off for Harrison Ford in the role. I have questions. There are things that are left vague in unsatisfying ways, but not to the detriment of the film overall. There's like sort of like nitpicky, do I want to pull in that thread or not kind of questions. And again, there's a plot line that I find completely unnecessary. There's a character in this movie that I don't understand why he's in this, or at least the actor. It could have been played by like a random Joe Schmo on the street for all the lines he got and for all the dialogue he got. The third act's crazy, and you're either in or out. But there's good set pieces. There's good Harrison Ford stuff. There's good Indiana Jones stuff. I think the only thing... I shouldn't say the only thing. That's not even the right word. But they do... This movie's more successful at playing up the fact that Harrison Ford is, 80 years old in this movie. That sort of is something they gloss over in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Like I said, other than Mutt's quips, Indy still does Indy things. In this movie, Indy can't do those things. And I think that serves the movie a bit better because we rely more on Helena for some of our action sequences. But that doesn't mean that Indiana Jones is sidelined or neutered in any sense. He's still Indy. He's still doing things. And I think this movie's worth checking out. If I was to put it on the bucket scale, right now it's real close to 7-ish buckets. Like 6.5 is kind of where I'm landing at the moment. But subsequent viewings will probably push me to 6. Like I said, I do really like a couple sequences, and I do want to see a couple things again. Again, I don't want to say too much about specific elements of the plot right now, but we may get into a spoiler-heavy episode of the show where we really dive into Dial of Destiny, and if that happens, we'll break it all apart. You know me. That's when I love to pull in the threads. That's when I love to unravel the sweaters. And again, I try to do it not so much to tear the movie apart, but just so I can sort of understand its flaws and to me, that helps embrace the movie a little bit. You know, like when I understand what it did wrong and I can sort of understand its missteps, it allows me to sort of think, well, why did they misstep? And sometimes, not all the time, sometimes that helps endear the movie to me. Like I said, I rewatched Kingdom of the Crystal Skull last night. I still have some bumps and bruises with that movie. But by and large, I just sat there and watched it, and I had a decent time doing it. so I think I've spoken derogatorily of Kingdom of the Crystal Skull in the past, and in a sense, I suppose it deserves some of its derision and criticisms, especially the ones that I have. But by and large, I think I like it more than most people, and by and large, I'm also willing just to know that I have like a later set of Indiana Jones movies that I can watch. You know, if I just want to keep the adventures going, you know, the first three are going to be forever untouchable. So we have to sort of break these apart. You know, you have your original 80s Indiana Jones movies, and then we have our latter day Indiana Jones movies, right? These later times, old man Indies. Again, even though he doesn't act that old in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, he's still punching guys 40 feet across the screen. And in this one, he's much more powered down. He's much more age appropriate in his actions and stuff like that. But yeah, I think we'll probably talk about that more down the road. So I'm gonna generously give it 7 buckets, tentatively. I'm somewhere between 6 and 7 on it. It could be in a half slot at some point. I want to see it again. I want to get a few more watches in my belt. I'd love to see an interview with Boyd Holbrook and him say like, "Oh yeah, no, I had a lot more in this movie and it all got cut out," because that would make me feel better about like why he's even in this movie. Again, there's an entire plot line that I'm just like, ugh, I wish that wasn't in this at all. But I suspect it's just in there as motivation for Indiana Jones to do what he's going to do. But we'll see. We will see. I think Crystal Skull's aged better than when it was initially received. I sort of suspect Dial of Destiny may be the same thing. But let's see how it goes. Like I said, the box office hasn't been great on it so far. But tomorrow's the 4th of July. Maybe you guys are going to spend the day in the theater in some nice air conditioning with a bucket of popcorn and Harrison Ford. That's not a bad way to spend the 4th of July. But by the time you listen to this podcast, it will be after the 4th. So I hope you had a great 4th of July and watched Indiana Jones and Dial of Destiny. And I think we're going to wrap it up right there with this podcast. I want to transition to a couple programming notes really quickly. Like I said at the beginning, initially I was not going to do a Dial of Destiny sort of recap because I wasn't sure I was going to see the movie, but B, I have the final 4 episodes of season 5 of Star Wars: The Clone Wars locked and ready to go. They're ready to be released right now. But there are some real life things happening that may affect the recording schedule of the podcast. So I am tentatively holding those 4 episodes for a week or two while I get things sort of straightened out on my end. And I don't think we're going to miss a week of podcasting. I don't think that's going to be happening. But we may have some more bonus episodes in the meantime. I have a couple Star Wars ideas I want to get to. It's just sort of a matter of time management on my part. So, fingers crossed I get that handled. Time is managed appropriately, and we're all going to be back here doing Star Wars stuff very, very soon. I appreciate you guys indulging me on the last few weeks for the Indiana Jones ride. It's been a lot of fun talking about Indy. If there's something I love as much as Star Wars, it is Indiana Jones. And I'm so glad that you all have hung out with me. It seems that you guys have been enjoying these Indiana Jones episodes. So I really, really do appreciate you guys sticking around for those. Thank you so much, Buckethead Nation. You are the best. Another reminder that this is the Mando Vision podcast. It's a Star Wars podcast. We're a small independent Star Wars podcast talking about Indiana Jones right now. My name is Tom, Narguy Tom, and I appreciate you all being here, taking the time to download, listen, share this show on the social medias. I really, really do appreciate it. Remember to follow us on social media at Mando_Vision on Twitter and Instagram. Email the show, mandovisiontom@gmail.com. Make sure to like, subscribe, follow, and share the show with all the Mandalorians in your covert. If you have a platform that you listened on that offers reviews, hey, write us up a review. Easy 5-star reviews. Those are great too. We truly, truly appreciate it. Those help our show stand out, not get lost in the cosmic shuffle of the Dial of Destiny. So I think that's all I have to say. I really, one more time, I hope you go see Dial of Destiny. I think it's a really fun send-off for Harrison Ford. Does it have its problems? Yes. Is it fun? Yep, sure is too. So go check it out and let me know what you think. Let me know if I'm way off base. And we'll be back very, very soon. But remember, this podcast can only end one way. This is the way.
This is the way.
This is the way. This is the way.